I'm recording. It's very vain, isn't it? I'm recording myself as I speak, but it's because Paolo asked me to. I was aware as I was chatting to people before we started that in some ways I'm kind of an alien from another planet, because I was intending talking a fair bit about large corporations, but from the conversations I've had so far, many of you, if not most of you, work in agencies and smaller companies. Is that right? Somebody here from a big corp? No, sort of. Right, okay. Because I was sort of assuming that the topic we were going to talk about was complexity. And I think to some extent, small enterprises, startups operate in a much more flexible, adaptable way. And the challenge of complexity is really being felt by the big incumbents, the large corporations, the large organizations. But equally, I guess you're all going to be working with, selling to, engaging with that world. And as I know as a freelancer, that join between normal people in the corporate world is invariably a challenge. So I'll sort of talk a little bit around that, and also some of the things that I think they're going to have to do to become more like the rest of us. But the reason they're feeling the challenge, and I think all of us are beginning to feel the increasing complexity of the world, is that we are living in a post-Trump, post-truth, post-Brexit, post-whatever environment, where the stability that we've all assumed for the last 20, 30 years is looking very shaky. So some of the assumptions people make about the way organizations run, the way institutions run, the way most of the people I work for run, is struggling to keep up. The scale of large organizations is a benefit in the sense that they're able to deliver at large scale, but equally the startups struggle when they start to scale once they get beyond a certain stage, and they struggle to manage themselves when they get beyond a certain stage. I've got a number of friends who run small startups that are beginning to grow, and a friend of mine has this nice phrase that once you get big enough to need a director of HR, you're in trouble, because you start to professionalize things and you start to delegate things to a specialist rather than doing them yourself. And so that then begins to build up over time, and that then becomes people's job. So you become a head of communications, or you become a head of HR, or you become a head of technology, or whatever else. And then things silo and they become rigid, and people then become competitive for things like budgets. So you then build in all these sort of structural dynamics that end up making most organizations, once they get beyond a certain size, or even just groups of people once they get beyond a certain size, become rigid. I also sometimes work with small groups of consultants like myself, various types of networks. And it fascinates me, even the ones who don't have premises, who don't have an office, who don't have the kind of structure of that type of environment, still end up, as my dad used to call it, playing at shops, where they will end up building in routines and processes and meetings and all the gubbins that comes with trying to talk to each other. And so even at that very small scale, there's a resistance to accommodating and dealing with complex, changeable environments. And we lose something once we avoid that transition. Part of it is because it's calling for a new mindset. And most of my work, I guess, is with senior people. And they have become senior invariably because of, I would argue, oversimplifying things. Being able to have a clear vision, being able to communicate that clear vision, being able to deliver over time. These are the sorts of things that made people successful in business. But because of that, in some ways, they become immune to the volatility of the world underneath them. They get stuck in that world of certainty and that world of structure, control. And we use words like driving change, which bugs me. People talk about an organization as if the whole thing was a mechanical system, that you pull a lever at the top and everything changes underneath. But it's actually never been that way. And I think partly it's because there's a nervousness the more senior you get that you're meant to be in charge. You feel like you're in charge. And in some ways, staff expect you to be in charge. And admitting that you're not in charge is a really tough existential challenge for lots of them. Because again, in the world of complexity, pretending that you're in control or pretending that you're in charge is in many ways the most risky thing that you can do. Because you're constraining the desire of the network or the desire of the functions or the desire of the world that you're operating in to be more volatile and be more complex. So it's that risk of oversimplifying and controlling, trying to control an environment that's arguably uncontrollable. So how do you manage those types of environments? Now, I'm coming from a particular perspective, having spent as long as I have on the internet and having seen the potential of the internet to help people connect and work stuff out together, which is what motivated people like Paolo and I in the early days to get involved in all of this. It was this fact that I could reach out across all sorts of geographical, political, or even organizational boundaries and connect with other people to get things done. So I didn't need, the whole principle of the internet in the early days was it was decentralized. So you get used to being able to reach out, find smart people, have conversations and begin to do things. Now, even to this day, within most corporations, that's really, really difficult. My wife's just started a corporate job for the first time in about 20 years, and she may not last because she's in an office with nobody talking to anybody else, all sitting staring at the computer screens, arguably faffing around with fonts and PowerPoint or beating each other up on email and not talking to each other, okay? Because they've got themselves stuck in that process-driven, rigid environment. One of the elements of a burning platform for people in organizations that I'm trying to convey to them at the moment is that if that's all you're doing, then AI can do that. We have technologies nowadays that if you're just doing a bureaucratic, repetitious, process-driven job, there's a real risk that technology will begin to replace you within the next 10, 20 years. So again, arguably the types of skills, the types of perspectives that we've trained out of people, i.e. being independent, being vocal, being disruptive, talking to each other, these are all things that are conventionally disapproved of in many environments in the workplace. And right from school, we condition people to be cogs in wheels, which is what we used to want people to do in the workplace. We wanted them to be predictable, we wanted them to be stable, we wanted them to be easily managed, if you like. And we were just talking about grammar schools. And my two girls went to the local grammar school. And in the sixth form, they're allowed not to wear school uniform. But they are required to wear office-appropriate attire. What the hell does that mean? So for the boys, it's cheap suits. And for the girls, it's a world of confusion and pain. And both of my daughters, having got A's and A stars for their grades, got reprimanded on a regular basis for their misinterpretation of what office-appropriate attire was. But it's bizarre when you think of where we're meeting now, and the fact that the sort of culture, if you like, of this part, and the very fact that we can see the other culture over there. I always find it fascinating because these are the two worlds, if you like. This is the complex, networked, individualist world. That's the more stable, slower, more structured world. And of course, they're trying to get more like this. I mentioned small startups trying to grow and becoming big enough to get some of these problems. And a mutual friend of ours, Gary Turner, is the managing director of Xero, which is a very successful online accounting firm. And Gary's just getting to that stage where he's at that transition. So up until now, it's been small enough that he's pretty much known everybody in the company. He's informal in his dress, in the way he talks to people. He's encouraged people to be thoughtful and to connect and to use the tools. In fact, interestingly, he brought me in to do a workshop because although most of his staff are younger, and I guess the age of most of you in the room, so they know how to use the technology, but Gary was concerned that they weren't being robust enough in what they said. So even the millennials in whom people placed so much faith were still being cautious. They still weren't being disruptive. They still weren't pushing the envelope enough for him as a business owner. But he's also beginning to get to that stage where he's got heads off, he's got a team beneath him, he's beginning to get structure. So we were talking about how to avoid ending up in the same rigid, oversimplified world. And so there are companies like Gore who continually stop and cut slice themselves into, I think it's 150, 200 people, So there's no part of Gore, the clothing or the fabric manufacturer, that's bigger than about 150, 200 people, because they know once you get bigger than that, things start to change. We talked a bit in this in a blurb for this about tools, and again, technology, well, and tools can mean both methodologies and technologies. And I triggered yet another Apple PC rant on Facebook the other day there by describing my experience of helping Penny, my wife, get back into the Microsoft Office environment for her new job, and just being utterly bewildered. And it was partly just due to unfamiliarity, because I'm using my Mac and my iOS devices all the time. But it was also because the whole mindset was different. That Microsoft and the big corporate enterprise systems are the manifestation of that centralized, top-down, structured, managed world. Whereas these devices are the manifestation of an individualistic, complex, unmanaged network world. And so in terms of tools and technologies, I'm coaching a number of CIOs at the moment who are struggling with that transition. And how do they manage risk in a complex world? How do they achieve enough? I'm trying to avoid the word conformity or standardization, but that's what their instinct is, to try and again keep things simple and keep them straightforward. So even down to the documents that Penny's been required to write, she's working in branding and communications, everything's templated. So everything she writes, there's a template for it. And she has to use certain fonts, and she has to use certain logos. And that normalization of everything is the antithesis of complexity. It's because people are terrified of individuation. They're terrified of the messiness of people doing their own thing. And this forum, this Q&A sort of thing that I got on Facebook was two sides of that coin, sort of tense and fighting out the different arguments. But in terms of methodologies, this is why Agile is becoming such a thing in the corporate world. Sort of stuff that I guess in smaller groups and agencies, it's just the way you do stuff. Certainly if you're a developer, for a long time it's been the way people have thought. But like so many of these words, it's now been hijacked by the corporate world, and they're all trying to be agile. It's like cloud and everything else. It just becomes a word that people then use to describe things. But it's actually about that shift in mindset to a more flexible, more connected, more networked way of working. How you measure all of this is a real challenge for them as well. So most outcomes, most business, targets are numerical. It's financial. It's about raw statistics about activities and outcomes. But again, in a complex world, you're invariably not measuring the right things, or at least you're missing the complexity of the patterns. You're missing the feedback from the complex world. So a mutual friend of ours, Dave Snowden's been working on this for years around how you reflect the complexity and the good sides of that complexity in a way that you can then make better business decisions about it. So he's got a tool called SenseMaker, which allows you to see the sense that a large group of people are making of a particular situation. And it's using visuals and oblique questioning and trying to get people to not think in a reductive analytical way, so that he gets a much broader, much more real sense of what's happening. So I'm beginning to introduce this to some of the corporate clients, because they know their static, stable, managed world is beginning to dissolve and descend into this complex, apparently unmanaged and unmeasured world. So in terms of tools, I think we need more tools to help us to see the patterns in these complex environments. Last thought, in a sense, none of this is new. In as much as I worked at the BBC for 21 years, there was a group, a deluded group in the middle at the top who thought they were running the place. But actually the BBC existed because of the network of smart people that they employed that worked there. And there was always this shadow organisation. There was always the fact that in order to get anything done, you knew somebody who knew somebody, and you would be able to take action, and you'd be able to move on and do something. So that tension between the shadow organisations and the real organisations has always existed. And I guess what we're talking about as we move into a more complex and unpredictable world is that we need to get better and more honest about that, and get better at managing the shadow world and less of the pretense that it's a simple, oversimplified, structured world.